Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this Menlo Park Library event. We're excited to have Kate Bradshaw with us. On all of your seats, you have a copy of our current event listing magazine, and it's got all of the adult events and the children's too. Upcoming tomorrow night, we've got a storyteller telling stories of Nasruddin Hoja. He's the wise fool of Central Asia. He's great. And Kiran Rana is a storyteller and a Sufi mystic. He will be in this spot tomorrow. We have got films coming up, live music, the 100th anniversary of the German expressionist silent horror film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, is going to be shown downstairs at the end of the month. And our own librarian and film expert, Nick Shagda, is going to talk to us about it afterward. We try to keep it eclectic, so check it out and share with your friends too. All right, so Kate Bradshaw, she is a local journalist. She's with the Almanac, and she did a series of 100 interviews trying to look into the disparities within our communities. Menlo Park, East Palo Alto, North Fair Oaks. And she had the reporting series that's been on our wall. It's on the display wall through the end of February, and we hope you'll take a look. You can also link to our article. Please welcome Kate Bradshaw.
Hi, everyone.
Kate, you do have a microphone.
Okay, that's what this is?
You have to push the button on the box until it turns on.
Oh.
I'm sorry, I don't think about that too much. Right on top of it.
Is that better? You guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I feel like a rebel talking loudly in the library. So yeah, I'm a reporter at the Almanac. I've been working at the paper for a little more than 4 years now, mainly covering City Hall in Menlo Park. And tonight is actually bittersweet for me. It's my last day at the Almanac. I'm going to be, starting tomorrow, taking on a new beat covering education and health at our sister paper, the Mountain View Voice. My desk will be moving like 10 feet, so I'll still be around and very much interested in the community. So please feel free to stay in touch. So as a reporter tasked with covering the city of Menlo Park, I feel like over the last 4 years, I've come to know Menlo Park pretty well. Never quite well enough, but certainly better than my connection to the city growing up. I grew up in a small town in the Sierra Nevada foothills, and would visit my grandparents and extended family who live in the area. So it's fun because now I get to be their go-to source for all things Menlo Park. But I'm really grateful to all of the people who have taken the time over the years to talk to me and help me know the community better. So if you're familiar with the Almanac, you're probably familiar with our tagline, which is the hometown newspaper of Menlo Park, Atherton, Woodside, and Portola Valley. Those 4 communities. They're 4 of the most affluent in the US, and Atherton in particular routinely wins superlatives for the most expensive zip code in the country. And that comes with a lot of nice things, right? Homes are far enough apart and large enough for people to enjoy plenty of privacy and beautiful landscaping. Roads are pristinely paved. City governments have surpluses. And yeah, sometimes small grievances become newsworthy because it's generally a quiet, pleasant place. But that's not really the whole story of who and what our coverage area represents. These rich, aesthetically lovely communities don't live in a vacuum, and at their peripheries are other communities and neighborhoods where people are really struggling to stay housed, to be healthy, to find happiness in the face of chronic stress. And yet many remain deeply determined to make this area their home. The more I've gotten to know the area, the more I discover that if I am to really understand the community I cover, the more I need to understand the neighbors to this community. And to do that means trying to understand inequality. So that's my context, so I can flash back to that at the end. Inequality. So it's hard not to notice inequality living in this area. I feel like it's pretty evident in the mansions and the fancy cars and the hills. And as you go towards the bay, generally the houses become smaller and more densely packed. You can even see this traversing a road like Middlefield, right? going from north to south, it transitions from a pretty urban and somewhat dicey safety-wise road in North Fair Oaks pretty abruptly into Atherton, a lush greenway with old growth oaks, right? And it turns out that a community's tree canopy is actually a pretty decent proxy for its wealth. And then I was just going to ask, are there any sort of indicators of inequality that you guys see in the community? Anyone? Yeah.
I can go to a very big house over here and then I see somebody living in a bus. Or, you know,
Yeah.
a U-Haul or whatever you call it.
Yeah, a lot of RVs. Uh-huh. Yeah.
Grocery stores. We have grocery stores in West Menlo Park. They don't have so many in the other neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
banks.
Yeah.
Banks, yeah.
Yeah, so those are, all sort of pieces of this puzzle of inequality. And I guess the point is, well, why does this matter, right? And it matters in short because it's costing those with less their health and ultimately shortening their lifespans. So households in Atherton and Hillsborough earn about 4 times more than households in North Fair Oaks and East Palo Alto. And on average, people live 19 years longer in Atherton, where the median income is nearly $240,000 versus East Palo Alto, where the median income is just over $50,000. And that's data from the San Mateo County Health Department. So, knowing that, I set out to try to answer a few questions. How did these inequalities come to be? How are they affecting people? And what is being done about it? So in order to avail myself to additional resources in pursuing these questions, I applied for and was accepted to a California fellowship with the USC Annenberg Center for Health Journalism, which offers training and support to California reporters working on long-term health reporting projects. And part of that, I got a training in LA. I worked with advisors Amy DePaul and Danielle Fox, and had 6 months to complete this project. So once I was back from the training, I wanted to better define the inequalities that I had anecdotally experienced and heard about covering this beat. One tool that I found was the CALENVIROSCREEN. And this is put together by the California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, and basically maps out the areas where census tracts experience greater environmental health burdens. So I think the map largely speaks for itself, but I overlaid some of the key characteristics and risk factors identified in the vulnerable census tracts for emphasis. So you can see, areas where the groundwater is threatened, the water is impaired, people are particularly housing burdened, there's traffic, and then sort of the other neighborhoods with less environmental health risk, pretty much on the other side of 101, right, where there's spikeable, walkable, great schools, all of that. So I also then mapped that to the racial dot map, which basically shows pretty starkly that in those census tracts that I showed with those environmental health burdens, now those are neighborhoods predominantly with Hispanic and Black residents. So I set out to kind of try to understand those particular neighborhoods better. In East Palo Alto, I found some pretty startling health statistics. The rate for asthma hospitalizations are significantly higher in East Palo Alto than in the rest of the county. with rates for children about triple the county rates. And a quarter of East Palo Alto residents report that they have fairer poor health compared to 16% of county residents who reported the same. And then this is in the East Palo Alto General Plan, which actually has a health element. And it says that the most important variables in an individual's health outcomes are employment status and income. These factors determine a person's ability to provide housing, purchase healthy foods, and pay for medical services. Unfortunately, incomes in the city after adjusting for inflation have decreased since 2000. The city's median household income is just more than half of the county total. So these are some demographic statistics for Bellhaven. Median household income is $50,000. 21% of children live under the federal poverty level. 50% of adults 65 or older have a disability, and the life expectancy is about 78 years, significantly lower than the county median. Slightly different statistics in North Fair Oaks, but again, you can see that there are a lot of vulnerable kids and seniors in these communities in particular. So with these data points in hand, I knew that the data doesn't ever tell the full story, right? So I figured I would have to get creative if I wanted to actually reach the people experiencing these things. Partly because Spanish is the preferred language of a lot of residents, and partly because many of them probably don't know what the almanac is, right? We don't often cover East Palo Alto and North Fair Oaks, or reach out in Spanish to Bellhaven residents in particular. So that's where community engagement comes in. So what is community engagement? It's a growing field in journalism, built on the idea that readers and members of the community that you're reporting on can help shape your reporting to be more impactful. So a few examples. The Standard Examiner in Ogden asked readers for their questions about a recent fire evacuation, and then answered those questions in an FAQ format. Another example from ProPublica is asking women who experienced life-threatening complications from pregnancy or childbirth to share what they wish they'd known or would share with other expectant mothers. And that in turn helped deepen the reporting that they did. So these photos are actually from one of the community engagement efforts I did, tabling at a mural celebration in North Fair Oaks. I asked people to write on a whiteboard, what does a healthy community mean to you? And these were a couple of the responses. I don't know if you can read them, but one says, a healthy neighborhood is to be clean and respect the people. So the other one is to have more education in general. So with this goal of connecting with the community in mind, I really wanted to connect with these communities at the periphery of our coverage area to build trust and report accurately on the environmental health challenges facing these communities. So some of the work that I did this tabling event. I visited the North Fair Oaks Community Council and introduced my project to them. I attended a community planning workshop in East Palo Alto, and then worked with some bilingual high school students to do interviews, as well as middle school students on the photo element of the project. So some of these steps were more successful than others, but the one that really transformed my project was partnering with high school students to help me with my interviews. So I drew upon some of my past experiences in forming my approach to this. When I was in college, I got to do research work in Peru, where I interviewed farmers about their uses of pesticides and water. To collect the surveys, We partnered with community health workers, and the experience taught me that when you're going into a new community as an outsider and you're asking people to be authentic, it's really important to have folks on your side who know the community better than you do and who are easier to trust. So I found the perfect community ambassadors in the 3 students I ended up working with for this project, Natalie, Mia, and Ashley. They had come to a city council meeting earlier in the year and spoke powerfully about their experiences of the housing crisis. When I learned more about the program they were participants in, Y-Plan, that's a UC Berkeley-based program that teaches teens in underserved communities how to do public policy research and advocacy, I realized that they had the exact skill set I was looking for. I reached out to them to see if they were interested in doing paid summer research work with me. They also helped me to develop the interview questions. And this was based on their own experiences. So one example is, how many jobs do you have? Because for those teens, a lot of the adults in their lives work multiple jobs. So we ended up asking, how many hours a week do you work, to try to encompass the full breadth of those questions. We also broadened our area that we did interviews in from just doing Bellhaven, East Palo Alto, and North Fair Oaks to also including the western part of Menlo Park as well as Palo Alto. And then another question was, have you ever delayed seeking healthcare because of the cost? Because one of the students mentioned that she had experienced that personally. So, doing the interviews, we spent about 2 weekends working together. We conducted 100 interviews, about 40 of them were in Spanish, and we talked to people outside at parks, community events, and then afterwards we entered the interview responses into a shared Google spreadsheet. So one of the things that I had been warned about in approaching this process was the concept of survey fatigue. Someone had pointed out to me that local residents are often surveyed by local researchers, but follow-up is often rarer, and community change as a result of that research is rarer still. So people are jaded, is what I was told. I didn't really find that to be the case, and I honestly think that was because we presented ourselves as friendly young people, and especially having teens who are from the community, it helped a lot, I think. I think the students I worked with really just disarmed people, and especially because they could speak Spanish, it made a huge difference. So these are some photos from the project. And then the other piece of this community engagement was working with Girls to Women in East Palo Alto. And as part of that, we reached out to these middle school students who were doing a summer program and asked them what is healthy in your community and what is unhealthy, and gave them a little photo lesson. Our photographer came in and taught them, some basics, and then we gave them disposable cameras, and then we later used the photos in a show at Cafe Zoe, and they're actually on display here at the library as well. So, through the interviews, we identified a few key community health concerns. Housing by far was the biggest. About 45 of the 100 respondents that we talked to said it was their top concern. Next was income inequality, traffic, cost of healthcare, mental health, air pollution, access to healthy food, climate change, and toxic stress. So lots of issues. But that framework sort of shaped how I moved the series forward as far as covering which issues I wanted to report on deeper. So back to my original questions, right? How did these inequalities come to be? So Menlo Park has a history of housing discrimination. And I had always heard that blockbusting had happened, but that was only sort of anecdotally. That's the process by which a real estate would try to scare white homers into a neighborhood, or in a neighborhood, into selling their homes at a low price by telling them that black people were buying houses nearby. And then they would go back and sell those houses at higher prices to black families, drawing upon white racial fears to gain profit and segregate the community. So I found evidence of this in a 1960 U.S. Civil Rights Commission hearing that had some pretty damning research about discriminatory practices in real estate in this area in particular. Part of that came from research undercover by, they would have a white woman and a black woman approach the same realtors and essentially see how different the responses were as far as where they would show homes. So here is a 1957 conversation between a real estate agent and a white woman researcher in Menlo Park in 1957. The realtor says, "Of course, we realtors have been accused by NatCap of promoting segregated areas along the peninsula." I asked, "What is NatCap?" He says, "That is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Why, just today I had a Negro woman looking for homes in this area, but we don't show them any property this side of Bayshore." The realtor gave me another listing, this in Menlo Park. I asked whether it was in a restricted area. He answered, "Of course, there is no restriction anymore because the Supreme Court says that we cannot restrict areas on the basis of color or creed anymore. However, property owners can keep an area all white by banding together and agreeing to refuse to sell." And a 1961 report that came out a little bit later by the Civil Rights Commission of the U.S. on housing found that, quote, "in the Palo Alto area, only 3 of the 600 real estate brokers and salesmen show property on a non-discriminatory basis." So you have that history, plus the lack of control in communities of color over governing their communities. And it leads to outcomes where less desirable and more polluting land uses are often in or near communities of color. And there are a few examples of how this can happen. One is when highways in particular are placed closer to communities of color, that can lead to higher rates of particulate matter in the air that people breathe. And another example is of where dumps or chemical recycling plants are closer to those communities, which can increase people's exposure to toxic waste. So according to the Environmental Protection Agency, African Americans are about 1.5 times more likely to be environmentally burdened with exposure to tiny particulate matter of 2.5 micrometers or less. And other non-white people are about 1.25 times more likely to bear this burden than their white counterparts. These small particles have been associated with reduced lung function, chronic bronchitis, and premature death. But the agency offers very little advice about how to avoid those particles. One brochure says, quote, "Plan outdoor activities for days when particle levels are lower, and don't exercise near busy roads. Particle levels are generally higher in these areas." Well, that's easy to say, but how can you really live that way, right? Another example is in East Palo Alto, the Romic chemical company discharged toxic solvents and chemicals into the community for decades before it was shut down in 2007, due in part to youth activism. So another issue today is how all of those issues historically have been compounded with the housing crisis. And I think it's really painful to hear about, especially because these communities were kind of forced into the area in the first place through this discriminatory housing practices, and now they're being displaced from those same neighborhoods that they were more or less forced to move into. Bellhaven and East Palo Alto were some of the only places in the region in the 60s where African American families could buy homes. And after embracing these communities and making them their homes, many have been uprooted. Menlo Park's African American population has declined by about 2/3 since 1970. So among the people who are experiencing housing insecurity right now, there are health impacts associated with that. So there's the physical health impact of having substandard housing. And that can be, an increased risk of respiratory and infectious disease from living in cramped conditions. It can mean asthma or allergic reactions from mold in the house. And being entirely homeless brings with it a whole other set of health risks, right? Exposure, feet problems, abscesses, sores, and then bad circulation from not really having a place to lay down were all things that I heard from physicians as being problems specific to unhoused individuals. And then just the stress of trying to keep yourself housed, right? It can be super stressful, and people often lose a lot of sleep over it, which then also triggers health impacts. And this is from the Dr. Scott Morrow, the key health guy in San Mateo County, who says you can't be healthy without a home. So another way that households that are experiencing these insecurities are affected is food insecurity. And that's impacted by proximity, quality, and cost to quality or to healthy food, right? You have food deserts, which are areas where food is not physically nearby, where your nearest grocery store is a mile or more away. You have food swamps, which is an area where unhealthy food may be abundant, but it's not healthy food. And then you have what I call food boutiques, which are areas where only high-cost food is accessible. So think about some of the local grocery chains where nothing is ever really on sale. And this can actually be a reinforcing cycle. A 2017 Forbes story discusses how homes near Whole Foods and Trader Joe's locations tend to cost more and appreciate faster than median US homes. So food security is often tied to housing insecurity. If you don't have a kitchen or have limited kitchen access, you're probably going to have a constrained ability to prepare healthy foods. And it's hard to make time to eat healthy or to learn to eat healthy if you're working multiple jobs and are trying to save money for rent. The other form of insecurity that I explored is transportation insecurity. And that's sort of the way that communities are disproportionately burdened by traffic and its problems of pollution. So one of the interesting facts that I found in my work was that about 84% of trips in East Palo Alto don't start or end in city limits. yet residents have 3 times the county asthma rate. And that partly has to do with, where the roads are and the fact that those are, heavily trafficked roads by a lot of commuters.
What do those numbers mean next to the cities?
Yeah, so these are actually the average number of miles that residents drive per day.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's actually, the most in Atherton. Yeah, Atherton still has very good air quality. And then kind of bringing all of this together is the issue of climate insecurity and how the communities of Bellhaven, East Palo Alto, and North Fair Oaks, they don't only have this history of exclusionary and environmental trauma from their past and the sort of barriers to accessing healthy lifestyles today, but they also face greater vulnerability to the threats created by climate change in the future. So research shows that communities defined as being, quote, socially vulnerable stand a greater risk of being more impacted by the adverse effects of climate change. So some vulnerability factors are being low income, a person of color, a woman, a senior, a child, someone with disabilities, a renter, someone who's geographically or linguistically isolated if you don't speak the predominant language, and then people who are isolated from public agencies, oftentimes because one fears them. You're more vulnerable if you don't have a car, health insurance, or a high school diploma, or if you have or have ever been incarcerated. So, what are people doing to address some of these problems? And this was actually one of the highlights of this project for me, was getting to learn about the really cool, inspiring projects that are being done throughout these communities to address various aspects of these seemingly intractable problems that I've been talking about. So, in the area of air quality, Sustainable Silicon Valley is a nonprofit that's starting its own data collection system with air quality monitors in East Palo Alto to better understand how traffic affects air quality. To address flooding, San Mateo County plans to expand its flood protection district to boost resiliency against sea level rise, and that has moved forward, I think, since I wrote this piece. To sort of address the issue of kids and trauma, the county health department is developing a community collaboration for children's success that's doing trauma-informed community building. And in the area of water quality, Youth United for Community Action and Nuestra Casa collected more than 700 surveys about people's concerns about water in East Palo Alto, and are developing plans for more community engagement on that front. More, so in the area of food security, Samaritan House in North Fair Oaks and Redwood City runs a food pharmacy that provides low-income patients with free food to help address diabetes. Second Harvest Food Bank offers cooking classes and demos to clients to help familiarize them with new kinds of produce. It has also pushed back against the Trump administration policies to deter immigrant families from accessing federal food support. And one of the quotes from a nutritionist I interviewed there had this really cool concept that she talked about. She said, quote, "Everybody has some complicated relationship with food for whatever reason that is. I think one of our roles as being on the nutrition team here is the start of the process of healing that." So I was super impressed with their work. Fuse Core is a program that sort of puts well-qualified professionals into cities to help them work on sort of these deep, intractable problems. And Susan Barnes, a fellow in East Palo Alto is researching how the city can tackle its commuter-caused congestion problem. And then these are some of the various organizations that provide health services in the community. So just to wrap up, I would say one of my biggest takeaways from this project was a newfound respect for the grit and the generosity of all of the people who are working so hard to make this area their own. Even though very few of the people we interviewed earn the area median income of 6 figures, nearly 80% of the residents of Belhaven, North Fair Oaks, and East Palo Alto we interviewed said that they plan to stay in the community for the next 5 years. 78% said they felt a sense of belonging in their community. These are people who are fighting really hard to be here. They're not going anywhere. And I know that I want to be better at listening to what they have to say. So these are some sources that I used in my project that would definitely recommend this being a library. But I think you guys put up a whole set of your own recommendations. And then, yeah, this is the links to the series that I wrote, as well as an interactive timeline that I developed. And this was actually really cool because Menlo Together, which is a Menlo Park nonprofit that's new, actually held a community meeting to start talking about some of these issues and this history. And so they did some of their own research that is incorporated into that timeline. Yeah, and then just wanted to open it up to questions and then really quickly point out these are, the middle school students who took those photos. I think it's important to sort of keep them in mind as kind of the hope for the future and all of that. So anyway, thanks. Yeah.
I know what East Palo Alto is. I know what Belhaven is. What exactly is included in North Fair Oaks?
So North Fair Oaks is unincorporated Redwood City, basically between Atherton and when Redwood City's official boundaries start.
All on the other side of 101? All three of these communities are on the other side?
No,
of
it's
101?
actually more between, I would say, Middlefield and 101. I have to have a map to point out the exact boundaries, but yeah.
And then the next part of that is, what differences do the governance situation make? East Palo Alto is its own city, probably on the poorer end of cities and incorporated cities in the community. Belhaven is at the probably the lower socioeconomic end of one of the richer cities in the community, in the peninsula, Menlo Park, and the North Fair Oaks is unincorporated. What difference does all that make?
Yeah, so that's actually a huge part of the story, right, is because they all have their own different governance structures. And so the way that communities go about trying to, solve these problems on their own is different, right? East Palo Alto Incorporated has a city in the early 80s. I believe I have to check the exact year.
84.
84, thank you. Belhaven, for the first time in 30 years, now has its own city council representative, and that took the threat of a lawsuit. And then in North Fair Oaks, I think it's an ongoing problem, right? It's officially governed by the Board of Supervisors, and they do have a community council, but one of the members of the community council that I spoke with said that they still feel like they don't have a lot of say in what happens in the community. He said they felt like, a dog that can bark but not bite. So yeah, I think that's a huge piece of how these communities are addressing these problems. Yeah.
I'm not sure if this was part of your project, but I'm not new to the Bay Area, but new to the peninsula. I grew up in the East Bay. I'm curious about what the process was like of East Palo Alto not being part of Palo Alto anymore, and what impact that had on disparities given the limited city budget that East Palo Alto now has.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting part of the story. My understanding is that I'm here, our East Palo Alto expert.
East
But-
Palo Alto was never part of Palo
Whatever
Alto.
was, okay.
They were an unincorporated part of, just like North Fair Oaks is now. And then they decided they needed their own police force was the most important thing. And the first law that they created was a rent stabilization, just cause for eviction law, which they did almost immediately upon becoming a city. And I don't know if you guys saw the paper this afternoon, but it says that for the first time, East Palo Alto had a $15.6 million surplus in their budget. So, as we say, we're a city on the move.
Yeah, no, and just kind of building off of that. Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that they, were able to enact rent stabilization in some ways has protected the community from displacement in a way that Bellhaven hasn't really been able to do. I think the numbers of people displaced, I think, from what I've seen, have been higher in Bellhaven, but yeah, I still need to do more research on that. Yeah.
I loved your series. I read every word. It was wonderful. One of the things I have wondered as an East Palo Alto resident is actually around press coverage. And because I have to, like when it's election time, for example, I have to work really hard to try to find information about the people I'm voting for. And I have to go to multiple sources to try to put it all together. The fire district is covered by the Almanac really well, and then some things that happen in East Palo Alto Online covers, and then there's the East Palo Alto publications. It's sort of just media coverage is really frustrating, and so one of the reasons I loved your series is like, oh, paying attention to us, yay! Yeah. So do you have a sense of whether that might be changing or if there might be more coverage?
That's a really good question. There's definitely a need for it, and I see that. And yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely an important issue, especially with the elections coming up. The Almanac doesn't. I mean, I think normally the way that we're set up is that Palo Alto Weekly covers that more than the other papers, but again, like resources are super thin in our newsroom, and it's really hard to set priorities, and I do think that there's a lot of room for improvement in covering East Palo Alto.
I would say you could join the Facebook page group East Palo Alto Neighbors, and it's a perspective, but it's another one.
It's another one.
Yeah.
Maybe a follow-up question to that. Let me just ask you to explain a little bit, or tell us how did you choose this? This was an assignment from the Almanac, so the Almanac's covering it. They published it. This was your idea, or this was how did it start?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I have been interested in sort of public health issues for a while, and just kind of, covering this community, it seems like one of those things that became increasingly evident and increasingly obvious that there needed to be kind of more of a dive into, why do these inequalities exist, and the sort of geography of the inequality in particular.
But you brought it up to the management, or you went to Annenberg, or?
Yeah, so I pitched them my project, got accepted for the fellowship, and part of that is, the newspaper's commitment to run the series once it's together. So it was a team effort across organizations. Yeah, any other questions?
Well,
Yeah.
I don't know much about it, but I think I read, and I'm just checking it out online, that a lot of those reasons that those cities are all separate for zoning was because of discrimination. And I'm sure, I don't know any more than that, but obviously this is why things are the way they are in those towns, is that right?
My wife and I both grew up here, and we were
Oh.
on the right. I was in St. Carlos. You were in Menlo Park, and that was pretty common back in the '60s and '70s. We weren't buying houses. We didn't. It was happening in a way we didn't understand, of course, at that age.
Yeah.
But it was very, as you said, Kate, it was very clearly the normal thing to do back in that age was for the white people to stay with white people and the not white people to be somewhere else.
So was the zoning there first, or was the zoning somehow created to make that happen?
Good question. I think
Well, there was a significant amount of what was called redlining. So the real estate agents just didn't show houses to people in neighborhoods where they might not be welcome. And of course, originally the population of East Palo Alto was there's a lot of Japanese truck farmers, flower growers. But we all know what happened to them in 1945. And then you had, I can't remember the exact sequence, but it seems like we had white people and then, oh my God, black people, and the white people moved out because the black people moved in. And then the population when I moved in here in the early 80s was primarily black, like 60%. Now it's about 65% Hispanic. So it's changed again. But the conditions are sort of the same. And
Kate, this
Sorry.
would be a good point you want to recommend that book. That we have. Color of Law.
Oh yeah, Color of Law.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So that talks about so the sort of efforts by the real estate industry to segregate things, but also the involvement of banks as well, who wouldn't offer mortgages to households that would
discrimination is the word.
yeah, basically.
They were blocked out.
It's a really, really good book, and it'll answer all your questions that you just had.
Okay.
Yeah.
Color of Law.
There we go.
I think the other book is also very good.
The
other
Road
one
to
is Chuck.
Resegregation. Yeah, so those are my reading recommendations. I'm sure there's a lot more out there.
And I'll just guess the city councils back then and the bankers back then and the city leaders were running the show were not racially diverse, shall we say, to say the least.
Yeah.
Say the least.
I hope you also had contact with the East Palo Alto Library, which is part of the county's library system. I have worked there on a number of occasions, just like I've worked in Atherton. They rotate a lot of us around. And the programs that they have there provide a lot of service to the community. And they're very responsive to the community, and they seek their input. They have lunch programs, summer programs, reading programs, permanent homework programs, a lot of programs that don't exist in other libraries. But that community needs it, and there are many people that are willing to work there and desire to work there. And I hope you recognize them. I haven't read your reports, but I was very interested when I read about this program. I do hope that you had a chance to talk to some of those people because they're doing a tremendous job.
Yeah, that's a great story. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you or anyone else can speak to was the East Menlo Park, East Palo Alto, Bellhaven neighborhoods, were they ever majority white? Like at what point in time did this? I mean, you showed the map; it's very obvious. When did the segregation begin? Did you have a feel for that?
My understanding of Bellhaven was that it was majority white, and then I would say late 50s, early 60s was kind of when that shift happened, and a lot of that was driven by the real estate industry.
But
Yeah.
why would the real estate industry decide that kind of the one side of the 101 was better?
Well, I think part of it was
Sorry, were the chemical plants there then? Is that part of it? When did they come to be?
I think those were a little bit later. My sense was that by getting white families to by using fear tactics, to get them to sell their homes at a lower price, they could make a larger profit by then selling to black families who had such a limited supply of where they could buy that they were willing to pay a lot more. But
I think that's in history when they talk about on the wrong side of the tracks. I think that was, like poverty, and so it's like the wrong side of the highway in more modern days. And I think that's read it's common in, many, many different places all over the country. And, you see those areas, like you said, they have more problems with, environmentally, things like that. So, again, the short end of the stick, so to speak.
Those areas are also more flood prone, so it makes them less desirable.
And the dumps, a lot of the dumps are on that side of the highway.
Yeah, so those kind of ringed the bay, and that's, I think, part of why the geography is what it is as well. Yeah, any other questions? Yeah.
Have any commitments been made by our city government to address some of the issues that you've surfaced? Are they aware, have set any priorities around helping measure progress in these areas?
So one thing that came out, it was like a couple of weeks after the series ran, so like I can't take credit for it. But the city is working with a group in the county to set up air quality monitoring systems in Belhaven to sort of measure the impact of traffic on air quality. And then, yeah, I mean, I was like a little embarrassed but kind of proud when Mayor Cecilia Taylor actually, when there was a conversation about Facebook's new proposal to build a new neighborhood in Menlo Park, like recommended to the developer that they read the series. But yeah, I mean, I think there's, a lot of these issues are pretty intractable, and I think the way that the community conversations are happening now is that there seems to be a shift in kind of acknowledging that there needs to be more housing built, and it needs to be more equitably available, and part of that means having denser housing. More multifamily units, and so I think that's all part of the community conversation that's moving forward. At least that's what I've heard from Menlo Together, is drawing on this history. How do you shape the community to be more inclusive? So I think that's all part of the story moving forward. But also room for improvement on policy issues around public health.
Speaking of that, you mentioned some nonprofit organizations that are clearly doing some really interesting and great work. What about the local government? Is there anything that we can applaud them on doing to help to settle any of this?
That's a good question. I mean, I think within the last couple of years, just getting a representative from Belhaven on the Menlo Park City Council has been a huge step. She's now the mayor, Cecilia Taylor, and yeah, I mean, I think the city is also taking a lot of steps. They're developing a transportation master plan, and part of that is also, helping people figure out ways that they can get around the city without driving by themselves, which, as we all know, is a big contributor to, air pollution and also greenhouse gases in a lot of cases. So that's.
I'll tell you one thing that happened recently. Stanford had a proposal to build a humongous bunch of offices, add all kinds of new people coming in, and houses, we're not too interested in that. And amazingly, for once, somebody said no. And it was primarily because a lot of people came to the meeting, stood up, and they had two words they said: full mitigation. We want a house for every job you add, or we want a housing opportunity for every employee that you're adding to the mix, and student. And they just kept saying that, and they were from all the surrounding areas. They weren't just from Stanford or just from Palo Alto. They were around the region. So I think that was a step in the right direction. And I think it really pays. Show up at the city council meetings, speak your piece, and hold them accountable. And if you don't like what they're doing, elect somebody else.
Because don't they keep trying? Because I know they did that with the fast rail. They tried for years to push that. You know, so if one administration, you know, prohibits it, then, you know, 40 years later they're back and they never give up. You know, there's always at it. My experience.
That's
you know?
true.
That's why it's so important to keep going to the meetings.
Oh, sorry, one more question, yes.
Thanks. I'm wondering if you can speak to how this grant enabled you to do this project and what it looks like in the state, like what the state of this small newsroom is now. Could you have done this project without this grant? How did it enable you to?
Yeah, so the grant was enormously helpful. I would say I haven't really taken on a project this ambitious in the past. As a weekly with 3 reporters, we're often stretched super thin, to be honest. A lot of it comes down to, you know, week-to-week council coverage, and to really do like a deep dive kind of project, I think required a lot of the extra support that I got from the Center for Health Journalism. So, you know, that was check-ins every 2 weeks with my community engagement editor, and then mentorship from a senior reporter as well. And I think a lot of it was a lift for the other people in the newsroom too. While I was gone at training, they had to, you know, step in and cover breaking news. And yeah, I was, you know, less productive in my other sort of main beat while I was working on this project. So definitely took work from not just me to make this happen. Yeah. Yeah.
Are you being replaced at the Almanac as you move on to Mountain View?
We are working on making a hire.
Good.
Yeah, not quite sure when that will be finalized, but yeah, Menlo Park will not be without coverage for long.
We'll miss you.
Well, thanks. Yeah. Thank you guys so much for coming. I super appreciate you all making time.
These slides available somewhere?
I can make them available. I can post them to our website.
Yeah.
Yeah.